Order, order. National Assembly is back in session. The next item is the Stage 3 debate on the Public Health Bill. The first group of amendments relates to removing restrictions on the use of nicotine inhaling devices. The lead amendment in this group is Amendment 3. I call on Kirsty Williams to move and speak to the lead amendment and the other amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I formally move Amendment 3, which is the lead amendment in the group, and all the other amendments that appear in it, which is 1 through to 26. As this is the opening of this afternoon's deliberations on the bill, could I place on record my thanks to all those that have been involved in the process of the bill to date, especially the Chair of the Health and Social Services Committee for leading the committee's scrutiny of the bill, which has been long and complex. I'd like to thank the Minister for his interaction with the committee during this period, and especially the staff of the committee that have done such a wonderful job in publishing the committee's report following the initial scrutiny of the bill, and all those that gave evidence to it. Deputy Presiding Officer, in moving the amendments in this group to the bill, members will note that they all relate to banning the use of nicotine inhaling devices. It seems to me that when considering the legislation before us, its primary purpose is to enhance concepts of public health and to deliver better health outcomes for the people of Wales. That goal and outcome is one that I wholeheartedly agree and support. And I welcome the fact that the government saw fit to use some of its parliamentary time to focus on the issue of public health. We know as a nation, in many regards, we languish at the bottom of all the wrong league tables for issues around continuing to smoke, although levels are falling, levels of inactivity, levels of obesity, although I recognise that certainly in some aspects of our population that too is beginning to level out. So it's right that the government should focus on public health. So the question for me is, do the measures contained within the legislation deliver on the government's stated goals and aims? And where it seeks to impose restrictions, additional regulations on either individuals or businesses or traders, are those measures proportional and fair? Now, of course, members in this chamber will be aware of my long-standing concerns around the approach that the Welsh Government has taken to the use of nicotine inhaling devices. My amendments here today seek to remove those provisions completely from the bill. And I do that because over the course of the deliberations, both in this chamber and in the committee, I have not been convinced that the measures proposed will enhance the health of the people in Wales. And I do not believe, on the basis of the evidence before us, that the measures are proportional to the impact that they have on individuals. Now, I know that there has been a great deal of discussion and argument about the issue around evidence. And I want to make it quite clear that it is not the case that there is no evidence to suggest concern around the impact on human health of the use of nicotine inhaling devices. It would be wrong to suggest otherwise. At this stage, in our knowledge and understanding of these devices, the evidence is not conclusive. But what evidence I have heard, and that I have been persuaded by, is that of people who believe that actually the use of nicotine inhaling devices in itself is a way that can be used to deliver better public health for the people of Wales. As George Butterworth, Tobacco Policy Manager at Cancer Research UK said, there isn't enough evidence to justify a ban on using e-cigarettes. The measure could create more barriers for smokers trying to quit tobacco. And Professor Peter Hayek of Public Health England told the Health Committee that at the moment, all vaping does is potentially save the lives of people. We know that tobacco is massively harmful to human health and massively harmful to the people who breathe in the second-hand smoke of it. And as we proceed today, my group will support measures tabled by the government to restrict the use of traditional tobacco products in many areas. And we are happy to do so because the evidence is there to demonstrate the harm to public health. But what we do know, and what we were told, that nicotine inhaling devices is a step ladder down from harm to harm reduction, allowing people who are addicted to traditional tobacco to use less of that harmful product. Many people do start off as dual users, using both an inhaler and traditional tobacco products, but they are able to wean themselves off. And I have been inundated by people in my own constituency and across Wales who have successfully kicked lifelong smoking habits with the use of this device. And for each one of those, it is an opportunity to begin to repair the damage that a lifelong addiction to traditional tobacco has caused them. Now, the Minister has not been able to persuade me, nor has he been able to produce robust evidence to suggest that people using nicotine inhaling devices do so as a gateway product into traditional tobacco. There is no meaningful evidence to suggest that people who use e-cigarettes have never been smokers before. The evidence is overwhelmingly the other way around, that people who use these products do so because they genuinely want to give up tobacco. They have often tried and failed other methods of quitting cigarettes, and they have found this method particularly useful. Now, the Minister will say that, no, that people shouldn't be inhaling anything into their body, and of course he's absolutely right. And I wouldn't want to encourage anybody who has never smoked to take up using a nicotine inhaling device. But there is no evidence to suggest that is actually happening, and it is not a gateway product. Nor is there evidence to suggest that children, young people, are using this as a gateway into smoking. Young people will always experiment. We don't want them to, but the fact is they will, whether that's nicotine inhaling devices, traditional cigarettes, vodka, cider, you know, a can of lager. We've all been there. We've all been there. My particular sin was the flagon of cider under the rugby posts of the Binyar Rugby Club. We've all been there. We wouldn't, and none of us want to admit that our young people do this, but the reality is that they do. But it is simply wrong to suggest that the presence of these devices actually leads young people into using them on a permanent basis and then moving on to tobacco. But what we do know is people use these to quit tobacco, and that surely is the most important public health message we could deliver. The evidence we have also received is this: if there is anything that equates these devices with traditional tobacco, that potentially is a barrier for people moving on to nicotine inhaling devices. And their restriction, and I note that the Minister has moved, and I give him credit for that, but any suggestion that equates both these products together is simply wrong and potentially puts people off from taking that vital step to reducing harm to the health by this product. Deputy Presiding Officer, the arguments have been held in this chamber many times. I hope, even at this late stage, the Minister will reflect on the evidence of the Health Committee that said that the Public Health Bill should not be jeopardised by including these provisions in a single piece of legislation, that this issue should be dealt with by a separate piece of legislation, and the remaining parts of the Public Health Public Health Bill should go forward unencumbered. I'm sorry that the Minister hasn't taken up that view from the Health Committee. But once again, I want to take this opportunity to remove these provisions within this bill and to ensure that the harm reduction that can be acquired and the human health gains that can be acquired by these products is not lost. Thank you.
Darren Millar.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I rise to speak in support of the amendments that have been tabled by Kirsty Williams in this group. I think one thing which has struck me throughout the legislative process in respect of this bill is that the Minister has managed to do what no other Minister before him has managed, and that has been to unite the cancer charities and others in the third sector with the tobacco industry in opposing some legislation. I mean, it really is quite a remarkable feat. And we all know, as Kirsty Williams has quite rightly said, that the bill is supposed to be one which seeks to improve public health, but that restricting the use of e-cigarettes may actually cause greater public harm than good. The man who's widely credited with inventing the e-cigarette 10 years ago was a Chinese pharmacist named Hon Lik. And he was motivated to invent the e-cigarette after seeing his own father pass away from lung cancer. And his intention in developing the product was simply to improve and protect the health of other people by assisting them in reducing their tobacco consumption. And since this invention came to market, millions of people around the world, including thousands of people here in Wales, have managed to quit or cut back on their smoking with the help of e-cigarettes. Many of these people have tried other methods to help them quit. Some have tried to kick the habit by going cold turkey. Some have tried to gradually wean themselves off tobacco with patches and gum. Some have succeeded, others have absolutely failed. But none of those different methods have been anywhere near as successful when compared to the e-cigarette in terms of helping people to achieve success in terms of being able to quit smoking. So the most successful, which we all share, Minister, with you. And this is the sort of industry that we ought to be backing and encouraging in terms of the availability of access to these e-cigarettes, not undermining in a way that I believe would be the case if restrictions on e-cigarettes were introduced. And it's for all of these reasons that I'm afraid, Minister, I cannot support your approach, your draconian approach to e-cigarettes, which is what you're bringing forward in this particular bill. And that's why I'm supporting Kirsty Williams' amendments, and I'll be encouraging others to do likewise.
Elin Jones.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'll be voting against the amendments in this group, and I am in favour of a partial ban on the use of e-cigarettes in particular public places. And just to confirm that Plaid Cymru will have a free vote on all groups in this debate this afternoon. And that will be quite challenging for Plaid Cymru in one respect, to ensure that we all actually keep an eye on our own votes as individuals rather than as a group this afternoon. Now, I approach this bill and this issue of banning the use of nicotine inhaling devices with a relatively neutral stance. I certainly hadn't been convinced of the need to ban the use of nicotine inhaling devices in enclosed public spaces entirely. Now, the evidence provided to the committee, as has already been outlined, very firmly informed us that there was particular health benefits for smokers to moving from tobacco to e-cigarettes, and I was persuaded very definitely that tobacco cigarettes and e-cigarettes shouldn't be treated in exactly the same way, and that the Minister's original intention to ban the use of e-cigarettes in all enclosed public spaces was not appropriate or proportional. However, during our evidence gathering stages, I was persuaded that we did need a partial ban on the use of e-cigarettes in particular public places for two specific reasons. First of all, it was on the issue of normalisation, and secondly, for the sake of clarity for the people of Wales and for the owners of public areas in Wales in terms of the expectations of them and the guidance given by government here. So first of all, on the issue of renormalising the habit of smoking or the use of nicotine inhaling devices in public places, I do think that that is a retrograde step and is a particular risk of renormalising smoking in the eyes of children and young people particularly. Now, I accept what's been said already by the two previous speakers, that there is no specific evidence of this renormalisation in the eyes of younger people or children, and perhaps we would have to wait for 5 or 7 years before we could come to a firm decision on any such scientific evidence of that kind. But I am of the opinion that we do need to take the decision now not to take that risk of renormalisation and seeing this activity renormalised in the eyes of our children and young people. And the second reason as to why I decided that a ban in specific areas would be beneficial to public health is for the sake of clarity. Now, introducing e-cigarettes has placed the responsibility once again on those who don't smoke or those who run businesses, are responsible for a school or a bus or hospital, to decide as to whether e-cigarettes should be banned or not in their own enclosed public space. Now, all of these public spaces do have to take that decision to allow the use of NIDs or to ban their use, and these are voluntary decisions. And I will give you an example of a head teacher that got in touch with me over the past few months to ask whether it was legal for a parent to be using an e-cigarette on the school doorstep as they were collecting their child. Now, the head teacher didn't know whether she was within her rights to ban that particular activity, and I believe that providing that guidance as a government and as a National Assembly in legislation would be of significant benefit to those people who are responsible for these public areas, particularly where children gather, to be aware as to whether it is legal or not to use nicotine inhaling devices. And of course, it is that clear direction that will emerge from the bill before us this afternoon. Now, most workspaces won't be subject to this ban, and therefore there will be many places where we are used to the banning of tobacco cigarettes won't be subject to a similar ban on the use of e-cigarettes, and therefore the staff in many workplaces won't have to go out to any sort of smoking shelter to use their own e-cigarettes. They can continue to use those devices in their workplaces if that is allowed voluntarily by their employer. Now, at the end of stage 1 scrutiny of this legislation, the majority of committee members were in favour of rethinking the legislation and in favour of a partial ban in a limited number of public places where the public and children do gather, so that it was a view that differed from what had been initially introduced by the Minister to the committee. To be fair to the Minister, he listened to the committee and he has reconsidered his original bill and rewritten it during stage 2 and also this afternoon as we move to stage 3. And I will therefore be supporting the amendments in the name of the government rather than those today in the name of Kirsty Williams and Darren Millar.
Lindsay Whittle.
Diolch yn fawr, Deputy Llywedd. I'm very proud that my party has a free vote on this very complicated issue, really, and I am supporting Kirsty Williams in her amendments here today. I'm speaking as somebody who's never, I don't think I've even held a cigarette, let alone smoked a cigarette, and I feel very sorry for those people who tell me that this addiction has a grip on them and they wish to leave it well alone. And I think that's what we can hopefully help them to do. In opposing the banning of e-cigarettes in certain public places and in places of work, I will admit straight away that there is conflicting evidence about the actual or potential harm that vapes can cause to their users and third parties. But look, when we looked at the evidence for and against, it was obvious that opposing the ban is the right decision. On the one hand, we had 2 articles from the USA that were firmly in favour of a ban in California. We never got to California, sadly, but another research-based study in the USA made the point, and I quote, that there is no current data to suggest that second-hand exposure to e-cigarettes has any health effects, and that the emissions of nicotine intoxicants from e-cigarettes were actually 10 times less than from tobacco smoke. That same piece of research found that 96% of current smokers reported that it helped them to quit smoking. Ask ourselves, why is it that Public Health England, which listed 185 research articles that it consulted, concluded that e-cigarettes are definitely helping smokers to quit and they should not be banned in any way? So who should we believe? Well, as far as I'm concerned, if we stick to the Welsh, I'm being heckled, sorry, if we stick to the Welsh Government policy of putting citizens at the centre of health policy, which I fully support, we should listen to what perhaps the ex-smokers themselves have to say. Those who gave evidence to the Health and Social Services Committee were all agreed that e-cigarettes had definitely helped them to quit smoking, whilst all other attempts had failed. What's more, the only influential public body to support the ban in evidence to the committee was Public Health Wales. Look at the opposite, those who opposed it, the British Heart Foundation, the Royal College of Physicians, the British Lung Foundation, the Royal College of Midwives, Cancer Research UK, all opposed a ban like we're talking about today. So these people genuinely know what they're talking about. Do we, how many of us here are qualified in medicine? With the greatest respect to my knowledge, only Dr. Altaf Hussain is. And look at this heading from a newspaper I wouldn't normally buy, The Times. E-cigarettes hailed for helping 20,000 smokers to quit the habit. I know you don't like props, but you know it's a fantastic heading. And whilst I agree it's too early to say whether inhaling vapour from e-cigarettes is in any way harmful, all that we can say from those who've given up smoking and now vape is that they definitely feel more healthy as a result. Look, the public is trying. It's trying. Let's help them. Give them that hand up, not slap them down. And if we ban the use of e-cigarettes in public places and workplaces, we'll be giving out a signal to those who vape that they are just as antisocial as cigarette smokers, and I don't think they are. So they'll probably think, well, I may as well go back to smoking anyway. And it's been mentioned about the manufacturing industry now being excitingly sort of growing in our high streets and indeed in the Swansea Valley. I believe there's 90 jobs created there. So, you know, we must think carefully about what we're doing here. Now, while we have clear evidence that vaping can help you to quit smoking tobacco, there is absolutely no evidence, has been said by a number of speakers here today, that young non-smokers who try e-cigarettes will then go to smoking the really harmful tobacco products. We know for sure that alcohol can be very harmful, not just to drinkers, but to others, for example, through acts of violence. Well, we wouldn't think of banning alcohol, would we? None of us would get a vote in Wales, I don't think. So why then should we ban the use of e-cigarettes, when there is clear evidence, as the Times editorial states, that inhaling nicotine vapour is 95% less harmful than smoking tobacco? It's been said here in this debate, but it's worth repeating. 95% less harmful. Look, people are on the right road to health at last. When I read my emails, you read your emails, people are telling us, I feel so much better. Well, let's keep them on that right road to better and good health. And I'm happy to support Kirsty Williams here today.
Jocelyn Davis.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I also rise to speak in support of Kirsty Williams' amendment. And even though I've been in politics for a very long time, I think I'm still quite down to earth. And with the nicotine inhaling device restrictions in this bill, I do think that the government may have lost touch with what the people of Wales care about. I'm also naturally quite liberal and tolerant about what other people want to do, unless there's a very good reason to prohibit behaviour. Now, when we wanted to ban smoking in enclosed public places, we took our time, looked at the evidence, constructed an argument and took public opinion with us. But I think on this occasion, the government has got it the wrong way round. Now, you all know that I use a vaping device because I've told you this in the past, but I don't think that stops me looking at this topic with some objectivity. Now, the evidence on health impact of vaping is mixed. The widespread use of nicotine inhaling devices is too new, and I think there's too little reliable evidence on their impact. But I wouldn't want anybody to be under the illusion that regularly drawing chemicals down into your lungs will do you any good at all, because it won't. But we didn't ban smoking for the smoker's health. We banned smoking because we wanted to protect other people. The evidence was overwhelming and the necessity to act was clear. People's health was being harmed by the actions of others. That was the justification for restricting tobacco use, and I'm sure it also led to the reduction in smoking, but that wasn't the reason that it was done. Now, there's no evidence that e-cigarettes have the same effect. Instead, the argument seems to be that the appearance of nicotine inhaling devices somehow normalises smoking. Now, I worry about legislating against vaping because the government is actually sending the message that it disapproves of these devices. I think the devices normalises giving up tobacco. And once smokers have confidence in their device and they want to give up smoking, they can easily become tobacco free. Now, when Action on Smoking and Health, surveyed users of electronic nicotine inhaling devices, they found that roughly 2 out of 5 users are ex-smokers and 3 out of 5 are current smokers who are trying to cut down on their cigarette consumption. The number of those who have never smoked turning to e-cigarettes is tiny. Similarly, the use of nicotine inhaling devices amongst teenagers is rare and is mainly confined to those who already smoke. Why would anybody move from a £5 a week habit to a £10 a day habit? I don't think it happens, and if it does, I think that is probably very rare. Now, more than a quarter of cancer deaths can be linked to smoking, and if we can cut that number by helping more people to cut back and give up, it is, I think, even by the method that the Health Minister finds distasteful, surely it should be welcome. Now, meanwhile, we do know that there are many things that are harming our health and our children's health, and I think the government could be focusing on those. How many times has this government derided Plaid Cymru's policy on introducing sugary drinks tax, despite the overwhelming evidence that their consumption is linked to obesity, heightens the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, and increases the risk of heart disease and heart attacks? Now, we know that driving cars harms your health, but the government actually decreased its funding to promote cycling and walking after passing the Active Travel Plan for Wales in 2013. Open cast mining has been found to have a negative impact on the health of children living nearby, but the government continues to support it. So there's a lack of consistency here. Children are permitted inside public houses where they can see adults consuming alcohol as if it's the most natural thing in the world. Fast food outlets are allowed next to schools. And I hear nothing about a ban on tackling in rugby matches for children, despite the fact that there's clear evidence that they should not be allowed. And this government did not rush to ban smoking, adult smoking in cars with children present. What about the volume of music in clubs? Schoolyards, well, it damages your hearing. Schoolyards are used for car parks, for staff and visitors. Diesel fuel used on school buses and public transport. I could go on, but I'm boring myself now, never mind the rest of you. But what I'd say is the precautionary principle isn't one that this government has as a top priority for things that there is evidence on, and things you could easily do something about. Now, there's many arguments that could be made for further regulating nicotine inhaling devices, and I don't disagree with that. questions should be asked about the regulation of their ingredients and the restriction of advertising. And I don't like the ones that look like a tobacco product. And I know that some people feel irritated to see the small minority of vapers who like to blow huge clouds of vapour in public. But that's a manners issue. And if you start trying to legislate on manners, you're going to be very busy indeed. And you'd be prohibiting, oh, I don't know, spitting in legislation. Would you want to pass legislation on that? Well, I no doubt some of you would. Maybe coughing without putting your hand over your... There are loads of things. I'm sure we could make a long list. I think if the Minister is determined to press ahead with this, he should do it in a standalone bill. I think it's risky of the government to jeopardise all the welcome and common sense things in this bill by using it as a vehicle for the Minister's opposition to the use of nicotine inhaling devices. To be honest, I feel that we're being blackmailed by the government to support the e-cigarette provisions by using the other good things in the bill that nobody in this chamber, I think, would be against. Just to finish, Deputy Presiding Officer, now those who choose to vote in favour of these restrictions, you will face questions on the doorstep, and you will meet people who may very well ask you to justify your decision. So I hope that you've all reversed your explanations.
Rhys Iorwerth.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'd like to speak to support Kirsty Williams' amendments and to state my opposition to the use of this legislation to restrict the use of NIDs or vaping devices, and I certainly choose to use vaping devices as a term because they're not e-cigarettes, a term that is used far too often in this context. They're not another kind of cigarette, but something different, an alternative. That's what a vaping device is, based on the evidence I've seen personally, which can be a very strong tool to stop people from lighting up and give up such a detrimental habit to their health. When smoking in enclosed public spaces was restricted, it was done for very clear reasons, and reasons that the majority of people, if not everyone, agrees with, namely to prevent other people from inhale second-hand smoke.
There is clear evidence that second-hand smoke is damaging to people, so to protect innocent individuals who were suffering through no fault of their own, we needed to legislate, and I'm very proud that that happened, and I'm very pleased that that most sensible step was taken in banning smoking in cars where children are passengers, although I am surprised that it took so long to achieve that. But on this occasion we are talking about something very different. I do accept that the intention is now fundamentally changed from the original proposal. Originally, of course, it was government's recommendation to treat vaping devices in the same way as cigarettes. And these devices would have been banned in exactly the same places as cigarettes, and the result of that would have been to undermine people's motivation to vape rather than to smoke, and that clearly was not the right path to follow. Now what we have is a far more restricted list of places where vaping would be banned, and I do know that that has been enough to persuade some people who were going to oppose the original restrictions to change their minds on the issue. But I have to say that I am still concerned about the messages that are being sent out in the bill as it currently stands, and the inconsistency that exists in terms of the steps that are being recommended. The intention now, as far as I can see, is to keep vaping out of the sight of children mainly, and that may be no bad thing, but why choose vaping as something that should be designated as an issue where we need legislation to protect children when, as we've already heard this afternoon, we're happy to watch for them to see people drinking alcohol, and when smoking isn't banned in the open air around children, surely that is a greater priority. Now, in speaking entirely personally, I find it rather strange when someone who does vape does so in a room full of people, and that rarely happens, if truth be told. Most still choose to go to some dark corner to vape. Personally, I don't think I would enjoy sitting next to someone vaping in a cinema. But there are a number of things that I would prefer people not to do in public spaces or where I am present. But why actually isolate vaping as an issue for legislation whilst accepting that there is no evidence that the practice is damaging to others? And if there is such evidence in the future, then let's review the issue. And indeed, let's look in far more detail at the impact of vaping more generally, so that we can take decisions in the future which truly are based on evidence. Now, the conclusion that I have reached, I'm afraid, is that vaping is set apart because some people think of it as something that is as damaging as smoking tobacco. And that is contrary to the evidence that would encourage people to smoke. I haven't seen any evidence of that at all. People who think that it is an antisocial habit, a bad habit if you like, something that people don't perhaps understand because they haven't had any experience of it in the real world. But as I said, in addition to looking at the evidence that's been presented to the Assembly and the committee during the stages of this bill, in my experience of speaking to people who used to be smokers and used to be addicted to tobacco, these vaping devices are a very powerful tool in assisting people to quit, and I don't want to see the Assembly undermining that.
I call the Minister.
Diolch yn fawr, Dipyn Lywydd, and as this is the first group in the debate this afternoon, can I too thank all those who've played a part in the scrutiny of this bill, from the point where it was a green paper, through to a white paper, through to a bill, through stage 1, through stage 2, and now on the floor of the Assembly itself. Can I thank members of the Health Committee and its chair in particular for the very careful work that they have done, the very detailed work they've done in helping us to improve the bill through the scrutiny process. Can I thank Kirsty Williams as well for the balanced way in which she introduced the debate on this group of amendments. She said that it is not the case at all that there is all the evidence on one side of this argument and no evidence at all on the other. I disagree with many of the points that she made, but I agree with that starting point, that this is an area where evidence itself continues to accumulate. The debate for us this afternoon is what response do we as a National Assembly make when we find ourselves in that position. Not everybody in the debate, however, has taken the balanced view that the mover of these amendments began with. We've heard other voices here for whom the argument made is that e-cigarettes are entirely benign. Their possibility as a harm reduction measure is regarded as proven beyond any doubt. We heard the utterly nonsensical and completely evidence-free assertion that e-cigarettes are the most effective way to give up smoking. There is no evidence for that assertion. In fact, the actual evidence, the research evidence, the evidence that someone who is interested in finding the facts of the matter would know is that e-cigarettes in clinical trials are found to be least effective, less effective than other forms of nicotine-reducing materials that are available to people already. I'll come back to the point in a moment. No, I'm not taking interventions because I think you've all had plenty of opportunity to make your points in this debate so far. There are others, and they, as the corollary of that position, that NID are only capable of doing good, is to cast doubt on any evidence of potential harm. Not a single shred of evidence, to quote some participants in this debate. No shred of evidence, apparently, of any potential harm to users themselves, to bystanders, to children and young people, to the community at large. Any of that evidence is simply dismissed Whatever its source, no. Whatever its scientific rigour, no. I'm not taking intervention. Thank you. However seriously it is taken by reputable organisations, from the Welsh, from the World Health Organization, to the BMA and to our own Chief Medical Officer. I was disappointed that Lindsay Whittle didn't regard the British Medical Association, who gave evidence to the Health Committee in favour of this position on nicotine inhaling devices. I was disappointed he didn't regard our own Chief Medical Officer, who gave evidence to the Health Committee in favour of the position I advocate on nicotine inhaling devices. I'm disappointed he didn't regard those as credible voices in this debate. Now, it is perfectly capable of taking a different view on the evidence. The position which the government has taken throughout the development and scrutiny of this bill is this: that we should preserve the potential health gain that may come from using e-cigarettes for smoking cessation, while acting now to prevent the harm which may also be caused by them. The potential health gain which may come from using e-cigarettes for harm cessation, and the harm which may also be caused by them. And that, Dipper Lywydd, is the most modest and mainstream way of proceeding. Our lives are absolutely full of devices where we use the power of collective action to realise the positives and to contain the negatives. Many of us will go home this evening by car, and our lives will be hard to imagine without them. But we are not allowed to drive simply wherever we like, whenever we like, and however we like. We legislate and we regulate to harness the good and to restrict the harm. Now, the regime which the government seeks to establish in relation to nicotine inhaling devices is squarely in that balanced tradition. Nothing which we propose in this bill prevents an e-cigarette from being used anywhere a conventional cigarette can be used. Anywhere you can use a conventional cigarette, you will be able to use one of these devices as well. There is no such thing as a ban in this bill, as I've heard that word several times this afternoon. There is no ban at all. If you are a cigarette user and you would rather use a nicotine inhaling device, then anywhere you use that cigarette, you will be able to use that nicotine inhaling device as well. That's why our proposals are balanced proposals. That's why we are opposed to the amendments in this group. Amendments passed at stage 2 and further amendments before you today will, if passed, identify in law those specific places which must be nicotine inhaling device free. These are places where children are most likely to be present. That possibility and that protection for children would be entirely denied if this group of non-government amendments were to be supported, because they remove all references to nicotine inhaling devices from the overview and the long title. As the member hasn't spoken, I will, of course.
Do you see the problem with children being able to witness adults drinking alcohol? And do you see the parallels with the arguments here? And so, therefore, do you think that alcohol should be banned from being drunk in front of children?
The parallel is utterly fallacious, Dipper Lywydd, because of this reason, which the member surely would understand. But alcohol is something which is steeped in our society already, where we cannot turn the clock back on harm that has already been allowed to occur, whereas e-cigarettes and nicotine-inhaling devices are harm that will occur in the future. We can act today to prevent that harm. Now, in what way would we not wish to prevent the risk of our children being drawn into nicotine dependence and from nicotine dependence into dependence on tobacco itself. Why would we not act to prevent that harm when we can, when the harm that is caused by alcohol has already escaped us and we don't have the opportunity that the member points to? The things are simply not a parallel with one another, and to not do the things we can do because there are things that we cannot is hardly a progressive position for her to advocate in front of this Assembly. So the effects of these amendments in this group will be to allow the use of nicotine inhaling devices anywhere and everywhere. All of the amendments in this group will be opposed by the government side today. We will follow in the great radical tradition of Welsh public health policy, and that is a tradition that means that we should act now to prevent harm that need never happen.
And I call Kirsty Williams to reply.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I must say I'm really surprised by the Health Minister's response to Leanne Wood with regards to alcohol. To state because alcohol is a mainstream activity in our culture and lives, and therefore we should not do something to try and restrict the harm that alcohol has on our society, actually flies in the face of many of the actions and many of the policies that the Minister himself advocates in this chamber and spends considerable public resources in trying to combat. So the Minister can't have it both ways. He can't have an alcohol and drugs misuse strategy. He can't spend money on trying to convince those in our society who do harm to themselves and to their communities by abusing alcohol, and then say what he has said this afternoon. And I'm really sorry that the debate has descended to that level. And indeed, if I may, Minister, with all due respect, trying to equate the fact that we regulate driving to protect society with the measures here before us are again, you know, I think perhaps a desperate attempt. Can I thank the colleagues around the chamber for their contributions, though? I appreciate it very much indeed. Darren talked about the potential of putting off people from looking to reduce harm to their health by traditional tobacco products. Actually, I'm less concerned about driving people out to the smoking shed, because the vapers that I have met that have successfully given up cigarettes, they rejoice in their fact, because as was referred to earlier, they feel so much better for being tobacco-free. And I'm confident that those people will continue to be tobacco-free. What really concerns me is those people who are still using cigarettes, still smoking cigarettes, they will be put off from taking that step down.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for taking intervention. It's very clear that you were listening to my contribution. I'm grateful for that. The Minister, of course, didn't listen to my contribution. He suggested that I said that there was not a shred of evidence to support some of the points which were made. Of course, my reference to that referred specifically to this issue of undermining the smoking ban, and only that. But I'm very grateful for you taking the opportunity to take this intervention in order for me to make that point.
Thank you, Darren. Ellen went on to talk about her reasons why she feels the approach by the government this afternoon is worthy of her support. She talked about the principle of renormalisation, and I think that is worthy of due consideration, and there is nobody on the committee that wanted to see the renormalisation of smoking. But the fact is, despite hours and hours and hours of being in that committee, there was no evidence to suggest that these products, nicotine-inhaling devices, actually do renormalise smoking. And as someone said very eloquently in the debate, what they do is actually potentially reduce the number of cigarettes that children see. by encouraging people to take up these particular devices. It actually reduces children's exposure to smoking and actually reinforces that actually trying to give up cigarettes is the right thing to do for your health. And there is no evidence at all that we saw in a meaningful sense that said that by not restricting e-cigarettes, we were going to renormalise smoking. Ellen also said she was motivated by the issue of clarity. Well, actually, I think, and the Minister at the outset of this process said that he wanted to ensure that there was no problem in enforcing the existing smoking ban. Well, I tell you, this is really a dog's dinner now. Rather than promoting clarity, this just confuses the issue. You now have to have a long list to know exactly where this is illegal, so in terms of enforcement of bans and in terms of clarity for individuals, this actually confuses the picture and doesn't deliver what Ellen was saying, actually makes it more difficult for people to understand. Can I say about the issue of jobs and the economy? I don't want to dismiss those jobs and I don't want to dismiss those issues, but this is a public health bill. And I think we do have to be absolutely strict in our interpretation of this law in that sense. And therefore, I think those arguments are best made somewhere else because this is about public health. Jocelyn, very eloquently, and Jocelyn, I will miss you so much being here in this chamber because you always do bring that down-to-earth, park girl presence here to the chamber. And Jocelyn, like me, starts from a philosophical argument. As a Liberal, I do not believe it is the role of government to use the instruments of the state to restrict the behaviours and the actions of individuals in that state unless there are very good reasons to do so. And I have not seen that there is any good reason for the instruments of the state to restrict citizens' behaviour in this way. Ellen says the one thing I have convinced her of 5 years sitting next to her in the Health Committee is that she is not a Liberal. I do come from this from an essentially libertarian point of view. And like you, I supported the ban. I supported the ban on traditional cigarettes because the evidence was clear that your actions as a smoker was impacting negatively on another person. And that's where my liberal instincts end, and you have to protect the other person. But that is not the case here in the arguments today. Now, I've heard that the habit is vulgar. People don't like to see it. People don't want to breathe in other people's vape. And as I joked with Alan Davis in the committee, sometimes I'm overwhelmed by his aftershave, but we don't restrict. We don't. Just because someone is impacted upon somebody else by somebody else, we don't legislate in that regard. We really, really don't. And if we go down that road, we're in a very slippery slope indeed. It is right that people buying these products should know what's in the product, and it's right that these products should be regulated. I agree wholeheartedly with that. Can I talk to this point about effectiveness and whether this is an effective tool to giving up? Now, the Minister said that this is the least effective method of giving up traditional cigarettes. I think the Minister is referring to a specific report. And if you look at that report, Minister, my understanding of that report is that it considered both people that were using NIDs to give up smoking, and it included dual-use users who had no intention of actually ending their tobacco smoking habit, and therefore it is not a true reflection of the effectiveness of giving up. Whereas other studies have been quite clear that it is an effective method for people to give up. And that's why exactly the NHS in England is actually considering making these products available on prescription. If they were such a harm to people's health, then why would that be about to happen? The evidence does show us that if you equate nicotine inhaling device products with traditional cigarettes, it dissuades those who would be minded to use them to give up. Now, the Minister talks about a precautionary principle. My precautionary principle in this debate today is that I want to be very cautious about putting off people who could be tobacco-free because we will introduce this ban today. That is not a public health gain, that is a public health loss, and I urge the Chamber to vote in favour of these amendments.
The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed. Does any member object? We will have an electronic vote. Open the vote. Close the vote. Voted in favour 24, voted against 31. There was one abstention, therefore Amendment 3 falls. Kirsty Williams, Amendment 4. Question is, Amendment 4 be agreed? Does any member object? We will have an electronic vote. Open the vote. Close the vote. Voted in favour 25, voted against 31. Therefore, Amendment 4 is not agreed. The second group of amendments relates to